The Roman emperor was the ruler of the Roman state during the imperial period. The emperors used a variety of different titles throughout history. Often when a given Roman is described as becoming emperor in English, it reflects his taking of the title Augustus or Caesar. Another title often used was imperator, originally a military honorific. Early emperors also used the title princeps. Emperors frequently amassed republican titles, notably princeps senatus, consul and pontifex maximus. The legitimacy of an emperor's rule depended on his control of the army and recognition by the Senate. An emperor would normally be proclaimed by his troops, or invested with imperial titles by the Senate, or both. The first emperors reigned alone. Later emperors would sometimes rule with co-emperors and divide administration of the empire between them. The Romans considered the office of emperor to be distinct to that of a king. The first emperor, Augustus, resolutely refused recognition as a monarch. Although Augustus could claim that his power was authentically republican, his successor, Tiberius, could not convincingly make the same claim. Nonetheless, for the first 300 years of Roman emperors, from Augustus until Diocletian, a great effort was made to emphasize that the emperors were the leaders of a republic. From Diocletian onwards, emperors ruled in an openly monarchic style and did not preserve the nominal principle of a republic, but the contrast with kings was maintained. Although the imperial succession was generally hereditary, it was only hereditary if there was a suitable candidate acceptable to the army and the bureaucracy, so the principle of automatic inheritance was not adopted. Elements of the republican institutional framework were preserved until the very end of the Western Empire. The Eastern emperors ultimately adopted the title of basileus, which had meant king in Greek, but became a title reserved solely for the Roman emperor and the ruler of the Sasanian Empire. Other kings were then referred to as reges. In addition to the pontifical office, some emperors were given divine status after death. With the eventual hegemony of Christianity, the emperor came to be seen as God's chosen ruler and as a special protector and leader of the Christian Church on earth. Although in practice an emperor's authority on church matters was subject to challenge, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century. Romulus Augustulus is often considered to be the last emperor of the West after his forced abdication in 476, although Julius Nepos maintained a claim to the title until his death in 480. Meanwhile, in the East, emperors continued to rule from Constantinople. These are referred to in modern scholarship as Byzantine emperor, but they used no such title and called themselves Emperor of the Romans. Constantine XI was the last Byzantine Roman emperor in Constantinople, dying in the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. Due to the cultural rupture of the Turkish conquest, most Western historians treat Constantine XI as the last meaningful claimant to the title Roman Emperor, although from 1453 Ottoman rulers were titled Caesar of Rome, until the Ottoman Empire ended in 1922. A Byzantine group of claimant Roman emperors existed in the Empire of Trebizond until its conquest by the Ottomans in 1461. In Western Europe, the title of Roman Emperor was revived by Germanic rulers, the Holy Roman Emperors, in 800, and was used until 1806. Background and first Roman emperor. Modern historians conventionally regard Augustus as the first emperor, whereas Julius Caesar is considered the last dictator of the Roman Republic, a view having its origins in the Roman writers Plutarch, Tacitus and Cassius Dio. However, the majority of Roman writers, including Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius and Appian, as well as most of the ordinary people of the empire, thought of Julius Caesar as the first emperor. At the end of the Roman Republic, no new, and certainly no single, title indicated the individual who held supreme power. Insofar as emperor could be seen as the English translation of imperator, then Julius Caesar had been an emperor, like several Roman generals before him. Instead, by the end of the civil wars in which Julius Caesar had led his armies, it became clear that there was certainly no consensus to return to the old-style monarchy, but that the period when several officials, bestowed with equal power by the Senate, would fight one another had come to an end. Julius Caesar, and then Augustus after him, accumulated offices and titles of the highest importance in the Republic, making the power attached to those offices permanent, and preventing anyone with similar aspirations from accumulating or maintaining power for themselves. However, Julius Caesar, unlike those after him, did so without the Senate's vote and approval. Julius Caesar held the republican offices of consul 4 times and dictator 5 times, was appointed dictator in perpetuity in 45 BC and had been Pontifex Maximus for a long period. He gained these positions by senatorial consent. By the time of his assassination, he was the most powerful man in the Roman world. In his will, Caesar appointed his adopted son Octavian as his heir. On Caesar's death, Octavian inherited his adoptive father's property and lineage, the loyalty of most of his allies, and, again through a formal process of senatorial consent, an increasing number of the titles and offices that had accrued to Caesar. A decade after Caesar's death, Octavian's victory over his erstwhile ally Mark Antony at Actium put an end to any effective opposition and confirmed Octavian's supremacy. In 27 BC, Octavian appeared before the Senate and offered to retire from active politics and government. The Senate not only requested he remain, but increased his powers and made them lifelong, awarding him the title of Augustus. Augustus stayed in office until his death. The sheer breadth of his superior powers as princeps and permanent imperator of Rome's armies guaranteed the peaceful continuation of what nominally remained a republic. His restoration of powers to the Senate and the people of Rome was a demonstration of his auctoritas and pious respect for tradition. Some later historians such as Tacitus would say that even at Augustus's death, the true restoration of the Republic might have been possible. Instead, Augustus actively prepared his adopted son Tiberius to be his successor and pleaded his case to the Senate for inheritance on merit. The Senate disputed the issue but eventually confirmed Tiberius as princeps. Once in power, Tiberius took considerable pains to observe the forms and day-to-day substance of republican government. Classical period. Rome had no single constitutional office, title or rank exactly equivalent to the English title Roman Emperor. Romans of the imperial era used several titles to denote their emperors, and all were associated with the pre-imperial, republican era. The emperor's legal authority derived from an extraordinary concentration of individual powers and offices that were extant in the republic rather than from a new political office. Emperors were regularly elected to the offices of consul and censor. Among the permanent privileges were the traditional republican title of princeps senatus and the religious office of pontifex maximus. Every emperor held the latter office and title until Gratian surrendered it in AD 382 to Pope Siricius. It eventually became an auxiliary honor of the Bishop of Rome. These titles and offices conferred great personal prestige, but the basis of an emperor's powers derived from his auctoritas. This assumed his greater powers of command and tribunician power as personal qualities, separate from his public office. As a result, he formally outranked rank provincial governors and ordinary magistrates. He had the right to enact or revoke sentences of capital punishment, was owed the obedience of private citizens, and by the terms of the ius auxiliandi could save any plebeian from any patrician magistrate's decision. He could veto any act or proposal of any magistrate, including the tribunes of the people. His person was held to be sacrosanct. Roman magistrates on official business were expected to wear the form of toga associated with their office. Different togas were worn by different ranks. Senior magistrates had the right to togas bordered with purple. A triumphal imperator of the Republic had the right to wear the toga picta for the duration of the triumphal rite. During the late Republic, the most powerful had this right extended. Pompey and Caesar are both thought to have worn the triumphal toga and other triumphal dress at public functions. Later emperors were distinguished by wearing toga purpurea, purple togas, hence the phrase to don the purple, for the assumption of imperial dignity. The titles customarily associated with the imperial dignity are imperator, which emphasizes the emperor's military supremacy and is the source of the English word emperor. Caesar, which was originally a name but came to be used for the designated heir and was retained upon accession. The ruling emperor's title was the descriptive Augustus, which was adopted upon accession. In Greek, these three titles were rendered as autocrator, Caesar, and Augustus Sebastos respectively. In Diocletian's Tetrarchy, the traditional seniorities were maintained. Augustus was reserved for the two senior emperors, and Caesar for the two junior emperors. Each delegated a share of power and responsibility, but each an emperor-in-waiting, should anything befall his senior. As princeps senatus, the emperor could receive foreign embassies to Rome. Some emperors are known to have delegated this task to the Senate. In modern terms, these early emperors would tend to be identified as chiefs of state. The office of princeps senatus, however, was not a magistracy and did not entail imperium. At some points in the empire's history, the emperor's power was nominal. Powerful praetorian prefects, masters of the soldiers, and on a few occasions, other members of the imperial household, including imperial mothers and grandmothers, were the true source of power. Imperator. The title imperator dates back to the Roman Republic, when a victorious commander could be hailed as imperator in the field by his troops. The Senate could then award or withhold the extraordinary honor of a triumph. The triumphal commander retained the title until the end of his magistracy. In Roman tradition, the first triumph was that of Romulus, but the first attested recipient of the title imperator in a triumphal context is Aemilius Paulus in 189 BC. It was a title held with great pride. Pompey was hailed imperator more than once, as was Sulla, but it was Julius Caesar who first used it permanently, according to Dio. This was a singular and excessive form of flattery granted by the Senate, passed to Caesar's adopted heir along with his name and virtually synonymous with it. In 38 BC, Agrippa refused to triumph for his victories under Octavian's command, and this precedent established the rule that the princeps should assume both the salutation and title of imperator. It seems that from then on Octavian used imperator as a first name, Imperator Caesar, not Caesar Imperator. For this the title came to denote the supreme power and was commonly used in that sense. Otho was the first to imitate Augustus, but only with Vespasian did imperator become the official title by which the ruler of the Roman Empire was known. Princeps. The word princeps, meaning first, was a republican term used to denote the leading citizen of the state. It was a purely honorific title with no attached duties of power. powers. It was the title most preferred by Caesar Augustus, as its use implies only primacy, as opposed to another of his titles, imperator, which implies dominance. Princeps, because of its republican connotation, was most commonly used to refer to the emperor in Latin, as it was in keeping with the facade of the restored republic. The Greek word basileus was modified to be synonymous with emperor, as the Greeks had no republican sensibility and openly viewed the emperor as a monarch. In the era of Diocletian and beyond, princeps fell into disuse and was replaced with dominus. Later emperors used the formula imperator Caesar.N.N. Pius Felix Augustus, NN representing the individual's personal name, Pius Felix meaning pious and blessed, and Invictus meaning undefeated. The use of princeps and dominus broadly symbolize the differences in the empire's government, giving rise to the era designations principate and dominate. Evolution in late antiquity. In 293, following the crisis of the 3rd century which had severely damaged imperial administration, Emperor Diocletian enacted sweeping reforms that washed away many of the vestiges and facades of republicanism which had characterized the Augustan order in favor of a more frank autocracy. As a result, historians distinguish the Augustinian period as the Principate and the period from Diocletian to the 7th century reforms of Emperor Heraclius as the Dominate, reaching back to the oldest traditions of job sharing in the Republic. However, Diocletian established at the top of this new structure the Tetrarchy in an attempt to provide for smoother succession and greater continuity of government. Under the Tetrarchy, Diocletian set in place a system of co-emperors, styled Augustus, and junior emperors, styled Caesar. When a co-emperor retired or died, a junior Caesar would succeed him and the co-emperors would appoint new Caesars as needed. The 4 members of the Imperial College shared military and administrative challenges, by each being assigned specific geographic areas of the empire. For this innovation, often but not consistently repeated over the next 187 years, comes the notion of an east-west partition of the empire that became popular with historians long after the practice had stopped. The two halves of empire, while often run as de facto separate entities day-to-day, were always considered and seen, legally and politically, as separate administrative divisions of a single, insoluble imperium by the Romans of the time. The final period of co-emperorship began in 395, when Emperor Theodosius I's sons Arcadius and Honorius succeeded as co-emperors. 85 years later, following Germanic migrations which had reduced the empire's effective control across Britannia, Gaul and Hispania, in a series of military coups d'etat which drove Emperor Nepos out of Italy, the idea of dividing the position of emperor was formally abolished by Emperor Zeno. The Roman Empire survived in the East until 1453, but the marginalization of the former heartland of Italy to the empire had a profound cultural impact on the empire in the position of emperor. In 620, the official language was changed from Latin to Greek. The Greek-speaking inhabitants were Romaoi, and were still considered Romans by themselves and the populations of Eastern Europe, the Near East, India, and China. But many in Western Europe began to refer to the political entity as the Greek Empire. The evolution of the Church in the no longer imperial city of Rome and the Church in the now supreme Constantinople began to follow divergent paths, culminating in the schism between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox faiths. The position of emperor was increasingly influenced by Near Eastern concepts of kingship. Starting with Emperor Heraclius, Roman emperors styled themselves King of Kings from 627 and Basileus from 629. The later period of the empire is today called the Byzantine Empire as a matter of scholarly convention. titles and positions. Although these are the most common offices, titles, and positions, not all Roman emperors used them, nor were all of them used at the same time in history. The consular and censorial offices especially were not an integral part of the imperial dignity, and were usually held by persons other than the reigning emperor. Augustus, majestic or venerable, an honorific cognomen and exclusive to the emperor. Autocrator, Greek title equivalent to imperator, commander-in-chief. Basileus, Greek for king, popularly used in the East to refer to the emperor, a formal title of the Roman emperor beginning with Heraclius. Caesar, Caesar, initially the cognomen of Julius Caesar, it was transformed into a title, an honorific name later used to identify an emperor designate. Censor, a republican office held jointly by two former consuls every 5 years for the purpose of conducting the lustrum that determined the role of citizens. The censor could audit all other magistrates and all state finances. Consul, the highest magistracy of the Roman Republic with a 1-year term and one co-equal officeholder. The consul was the head of state within Rome. The last emperor to be bestowed the title by the Senate was Constans II, who was also the last emperor to visit Rome. Dominus, an honorific title mainly associated with the dominate. Dominus Noster, an honorific title, the praenomen of later emperors. Imperator, a victory title taken on accession to the purple and after a major military victory. Imperator Destinatus, heir apparent, used by Septimius Severus for Caracalla. Invictus, an honorific title. Nobilissimus, one of the highest imperial titles held by the emperor. Pater Patria, an honorific title. Perpetuus, an honorific title of later emperors. Bias Felix, an honorific title. Pontifex Maximus. In the Republican era, the Pontifex Maximus was the head of the College of Pontiffs, the religious body that oversaw the ancestral public religion of the Romans. Julius Caesar had become Pontifex Maximus before he was elected consul, and the precedent set by his heir Augustus in consolidating supreme authority through this religious office was in general followed by his successors until the empire came under Christian rule. Princeps, an honorific title denoting the status of the emperor as first among equals, associated mainly with the Principate. Princeps Juventutis, an honorific title awarded to a presumptive emperor designate. Princeps Senatus, a republican office with a 5-year term. Sebastos, the Greek rendition of the imperial title Augustus. Sebastocrator, a senior court title from the compound words sebastos and crater. Tribuneship attestas the powers of a tribune of the people, including sacrosanctity and inviolability of his person, and the veto over any decision by any other magistrate, assembly, or the Senate. Powers. When Augustus established the Princeps, he turned down supreme authority in exchange for a collection of various powers and offices, which in itself was a demonstration of his auctoritas. As holding Princeps Senatus, the emperor declared the opening and closure of each Senate session, declared the Senate's agenda, imposed rules and regulation for the Senate to follow, and met with foreign ambassadors in the name of the Senate. Being Pontifex Maximus made the emperor the chief administrator of religious affairs, granting him the power to conduct all religious ceremonies, consecrate temples, control the Roman calendar, appoint the Vestal Virgins and some flamens, lead the Collegium Pontificum, and summarize the dogma of the Roman religion. While these powers granted the emperor a great deal of personal pride and influence, they did not include legal authority. In 23 BC, Augustus gave the emperorship its legal power. The first was tribuneship attestas, or the powers of the tribune of the plebs without actually holding the office. This endowed the emperor with inviolability of his person, and the ability to pardon any civilian for any act, criminal or otherwise. By holding the powers of the tribune, the emperor could prosecute anyone who interfered with the performance of his duties. The emperor's tribuneship granted him the right to convene the Senate at his will and lay proposals before it, as well as the ability to veto any act or proposal by any magistrate, including the actual tribune of the plebeians. Also, as holder of the tribune's power, the emperor would convoke the council of the people, lay legislation before it, and served as the council's president. But his tribuneship only granted him power within Rome itself. He would need another power to veto the act of governors and that of the consuls while in the provinces. To solve this problem, Augustus managed to have the emperor be given the right to hold two types of imperium, the first being consular imperium while he was in Rome, and imperium maius outside of Rome. While inside the walls of Rome, the reigning consuls and the emperor held equal authority, each being able to veto each other's proposals and acts, with the emperor holding all of the consuls' powers. But outside of Rome, the emperor outranked the consuls and could veto them without the same effects on himself. Imperium maius also granted the emperor authority over all the provincial governors, making him the ultimate authority in provincial matters and gave him the supreme command of all of Rome's legions. With Imperium maius, the emperor was also granted the power to appoint governors of imperial provinces without the interference of the Senate. Also, Imperium maius granted the emperor the right to veto the governors of the provinces and even the reigning consul while in the provinces.